Well, thank you, and thanks, Karen. I'm having a great time in Kalamazoo. Thank you all. It's just terrific, really fun. And I'm not going to lecture. I've never been comfortable with that anyway. So I'd like to start by reading some thoughts that I jotted down about being a writer, and then open it up, and we'll talk about anything that anybody wants to talk about. And as much as I can, I'll offer my years of experience and some insights maybe, and then we'll see where it goes. So what I jotted down was just becoming a writer. How do you become a writer? It's different for everyone. I wouldn't presume to tell anyone how to live their lives, let alone how to unlock their creativity. I can only speak of my own experience. After nearly 30 years of doing it for a living, what do I know? That the novelist Paul Thoreau had it exactly right when he said, "It's not a great living, but it's a great life." I also know that it's shot through with contradictions. It's play and it's deadly serious. It's a joy and it's agony. That unlike any other job I know, it never gets easier. No matter how many books, essays, stories, or poems you've written, every time you face the blank page, you're starting over. And I know this, you have to put everything on the line. It's like falling in love or falling off a log. You can't do it part way. You have to take charge of your time, and then you have to risk everything to keep your time sacred. And that's just the first risk. You risk making a fool of yourself. You risk losing the confidence of your friends and family. You risk being rejected. You risk being ignored. You risk being cut to pieces by critics. You put everything you know into the work, and you risk demonstrating to the world that you don't know enough. You try as hard as you can to put it into language that is fresh, original, daring, alive, and you risk having it turn out stale, cliched, safe, and flaccid. You put it all on the line, everything you've learned, everything you've experienced, everything you've felt, your whole life goes into it. You finish the work, put it out for the world to judge, and have no control about how it will be received or even if it will be noticed. Then you return to your desk, open a fresh page, and start again. That's all I have prepared. Is it Mary? You're a creative writing teacher here, English teacher here?
I'm a writing teacher.
Writing teacher. And you asked the question about how much of the work is finished when you write it, and do you just dash it out or do you plan for it? My experience, for me, what works best is to do some of that dashing off. I like to start the mornings out by just free writing, and that takes the form of anything from poems to fiction to essays to nonsense, to lists of words. I often will start by writing random lists, just free associating with words, to get the language center moving. Very often, that will trigger something and I'll start writing. Now, this is when I'm not working on a book. Between books, I write in snatches. I write short pieces. And I'll take those pieces, and if something seems promising, I'll set it in a drawer, a literal drawer or a computer drawer on my laptop, and I will leave it for at least a few days, often a few months, sometimes a few years, and go back to it eventually, gradually, and start to work with it or play with it. I always think of it as play, but playing with it to see if it starts to come alive and if it grows. It's different when I'm working on a book. When I'm on a book, I'm carrying the whole book in my mind all the time, even in my sleep. I'll wake up in the night and it'll be clear to me what I have to do, and I'll jot some notes so I'll remember it and try to get back to sleep. And then in the morning, it's a matter of picking up where you left off the day before, usually by reading the work from the day before, making a few changes, and then diving in. What works very well for me is to leave a thought unfinished at the end of the day. Sometimes a literal sentence unfinished. I'll stop in the middle of a sentence so I know exactly what I'm going to write first thing in the morning, and then I will jump into it in the morning. But yes?
Do you have a structure in place before you write? Do you have a mental outline as to how it's going to go before you start writing?
I have a mental outline, but I don't hold myself to it strictly. But I have that idea just so that I know there are places I can go. And I know writers who work strictly from outlines, and then they'll kind of fill in the outline as they're going until it becomes a book. That has never worked for me, but I know about where I'm going. In the case of The Living Great Lakes, once I realized how the book was going to be structured, once I knew that it was basically a journey, that was easy. I knew how it was going to end. I'd been there, so that was easy. But my other books I've not always known where they're going to end. So I'll do both. Keep that outline in my mind with notes, lots of notes, and I use file folders for chapters, and I'm adding to those file folders and building it up slowly. I think the trick is to trick yourself into knowing that you're making progress, and keep building it gradually and gradually. And composing is a small part of the day. An hour or 2 hours a day of composing new work. You can write a lot, even though I do most of my composing longhand. And even writing longhand for an hour, you'll fill some pages. And I always know when I'm hitting a wall, and that's when I stop and try to leave it where I know what the next day will bring. And then I go to the rewriting. And to me, rewriting and polishing is the fun part. Composition is harder for me on most days. Some days it's just so easy. As I think at lunch I said that there are those days when you compose 3,000 words in a burst, and you know it's right, you know it's close to being finished, and you just think, well, I've finally figured out how to do this. It's easy from now on, but of course it's not. And you might only have one day like that every month if you're lucky. So do an hour or two of composition, set that aside. I won't even look at it again until the next day, and I go to the rewriting and polish it. By the time I'm finished with a book, the first chapter I've probably been through 100 times. I don't think that's an exaggeration. 100 times going through it, because the first chapter should set the tone for the book. Sets your voice, it sets the pacing, the mood. You want your mood to change, of course, but it sets everything up. And that first chapter, of course, is critical to keep a reader's interest. Somebody was saying last night that it's a partnership. The reader and the writer are in partnership. And I think of that constantly. I'm always aware of the reader. And I know other writers don't necessarily feel that way. I've talked to many who say, no, I feel like this is for me. I'm writing this book for me, and I trust that readers will be interested. And I've never felt that way. I've never looked at it that way. I've always felt like I have to put the words into place so that the reader will get them, will appreciate them, will connect with them. And how do I best do that? And that's where the rewriting and the working comes along. A lot of it is instinct too. You trust your guts and say, this feels right. But I always warn young writers not to trust that yet. It comes with years of experience, because when you're young, your gut tells you, oh, this is the most magnificent sentence ever written in English, and it's not. I guarantee you it's not. So with experience comes that. So other thoughts, ideas, prompts. Yeah.
What do you do when you're up against a wall? You got writer's drought. You know you can leave it to the next day, but if it still continues, what do you do?
Well, it's a real thing.
Yeah, I know
It's a real thing. I have a friend who's a crime novelist, and he's real stubborn. He said, there's no such thing as writer's block. That's just something weak people have invented so they can bang their heads against it. And, and I see his point, sort of, but in my experience, it's a real thing. And for me, I think of writer's block as failure of nerve, because it takes a lot of nerve to do this. You're, as you all know, you're putting yourself out there. And especially if you write about things that are deeply felt in your own experience, you're making yourself vulnerable, and it's hard. And you have to believe in yourself, and you have to have a lot of courage. And sometimes our courage fails. So what I do is I walk away from it. And I didn't used to. When I was younger, I fought it tooth and nail, because I felt like it could be vanquished, right? I wanted to be a tough guy. And I just made it worse. It just made it worse. So what I do is go for a walk, or go just take off for the day, hit the road, go fishing or canoeing or birding more and more. And my wife and I bird together, and that is really good. Anything for me, it's anything that gets my head out of my butt and out of the work, you know, and out of words, away from language. Just get out there. There's no better antidote for language sickness than the real world, the physical world, or people. If whatever your inclination is, go for it. And almost invariably, get away for a day, get refreshed the next day. You can see a way through. If not, I've had it last for a few weeks, and that's hard. There's no doubt, it's hard. When you have deadline, it's awful. When you have a living to make, it's awful. But with time and patience, it always comes back around. Yeah, Karen?
One of the things that I've heard in facilitating some discussions about this book is you have such a way of describing the same thing over and over in so many different ways. And I think like talking about the waves or talking about, the way you describe something. I'm just curious if that's something you're conscious of, like, oh, I can't say that because I've said that already. Do I need to come up with a new description? What that process is.
I am conscious of it. I don't want to repeat myself, and if there's something, whenever you see that I am repeating, as you say, and I'm glad you kindly said that I'd repeat it differently. I say it differently. It's because I'm trying to find a better way to describe or explain or evoke this. But inevitably, I always come to a point where I can't do it anymore. And
to clarify, it was a positive comment
Yeah,
that was being made, that they appreciated that, it wasn't saying, oh, he says the same thing.
I know. I get it. Thank you. Yeah, in that, there are a lot of times when I think, this is why a lot of writers are novelists, because with people, there's no end to the variety. With the physical world, you would think, oh yeah, there's only so many ways you can talk about waves or trees. But the deeper you get into the subject, the more you realize that also is infinite. There is no end to what you can say, because there's no end to the variety of things on the planet. And that to me is one of the really interesting things about writing about the natural world and about places, that the deeper you look into it, the more there is to see. And so I'm always reaching for those places. I'm always reaching for that place where the world is fresh to my eyes again, which is, as you get older, it gets harder, of course. We get a crust grows over us, and we start to think, oh, I already know that. And as soon as you think you know the answer, you're shutting yourself off from it. So I practice it. I've had friends tell me that what I'm practicing is a form of Buddhism. And I don't think of it that way, even though I've read some Buddhist texts and I'm interested in it. I don't practice that consciously. What I'm practicing is ways to erase everything I know, forget everything I know, open my mind, and see the world with fresh eyes the way I saw it as a kid. And I think I'm lucky in that I have really fresh memories of being a child. And I remember what it felt like to see the world when I was very young. And I work real hard to try to find that. And that becomes one of the practices that I use. And because I'm also interested in language, I'm always looking for language that I can use in new ways. So that, to write about nature, I will go to textbooks on computer science, and I'll read those books and think, how is this I won't understand them, but I will read the words and I'll say, how are the metaphors in this applicable to writing about waves? And it's interesting how often that works. That'll jog something. Or medical texts, or 19th century books of home remedies, stuff like that I've picked up at yard sales, because they're full of unusual language uses for me. Most of my inspiration does not come from books about nature. I've read most of the great nature writers and learned a lot from them, but as I've gotten older, I've found less and less in there that I can learn from as a writer, not as a naturalist, because there's always a lot more information. But as a writer, I don't want to write about it the way Thoreau did. Nobody can match Thoreau. But I'll write about nature the way some 19th century engineer wrote, maybe, or something. You know what I mean? It just look for unexpected ways of doing it. But eventually, I always reach an end, and then I think I'll never be able to write about canoeing again because I've done so much of it. But then one day I wake up and I go, "Oh, I've never written about." So it's a good question. Yes.
That's how you teach. That's your skill. You know, I think the repetition is a way of teaching us as the reader picks each piece up. It reinforces what you've said before. You draw your characters that way too. You know, you add a little bit now and a little bit later, and then soon we really know that person well.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, because it doesn't work to pile it all on. You know, the reader will just, it gets overwhelmed. And yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. And I guess without really giving it much thought, I work that way. Because I know what I like as a reader. You know, I don't want to get inundated with facts. And because I read a lot of fiction, I know what works in fiction. And it doesn't work for the author to tell you everything about a character right up front. So much better to let it develop slowly and to develop through dialogue and action. And yes.
Two questions. Why do you write in longhand to start? And secondly, can you talk about how you came to the vocation?
Sure. I write in longhand because I started that way because so much of my writing was outdoors in the days before electronic devices. And I didn't want to be tied down to a keyboard. But on the other side of the coin, in 10th grade in high school, I took a typing class. I was the only guy in the class, and I was terrible at it. And the teacher was even worse. The teacher would get us going, then he'd sit up there and he'd sleep. But I wanted to learn to type because I knew that I would want to be a writer. I wanted to be a writer that early. I knew I needed to learn to type. So I learned to type, and I can type fast. But I wanted the freedom of writing longhand. But now, as I've gotten older, I love the immediacy of it. I like seeing the ink on the page. I like seeing the ink bleed into the paper. And so it's become an important part of me. It seems like it's closer to the source of wherever the words come from. Although in the last couple of years, I've been writing a lot. I've been composing a lot more on the keyboard, and I'm amazed at how fast it is. It's nice. I'm always grateful for those days, but I can sit there with my fingers on the keyboard and nothing happens. I pick up a pen and put it to paper and something happens. So I go with that. I came to the vocation because I wanted it to be a vocation. I didn't want to dabble. I didn't want to write part-time. I knew very early in college. In high school, I had an inkling that I wanted to be a writer, but I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know how to do it. By the time I got into college, I knew that I wanted to write for a living. And what I then had to learn was how can one do that? And I just set out and tried things. And so for the first 5 years after college, I worked as a carpenter, so that at the end of the day, I was physically tired, but not mentally. I could spend my whole day doing repetitious physical work. Is really good for the mind. It allows your imagination to roam. My mind, I got in the habit of letting my mind just coast and go wherever it wanted to, and I would follow it. And I got to where I felt like I was being towed by a dog. It was a really good dog and a really interested one. He was always poking around everywhere, and I just trusted the dog. I would follow him anywhere. At the end of the day, I'd get home and write down those thoughts, and then work on in the weekends too. And then I had to figure out how do you make a living as a writer. And I found there were a variety of ways, and I looked into some of those. Like I looked into becoming a staff writer at a magazine or something, and I met a few of those people. But I didn't want to be tied down to that either. And I knew I wanted to spend a lot of time outdoors. And so freelancing for the outdoor press started to emerge as the way that would work for me. So I set goals for myself, and I said, I want to publish in the Michigan magazines, the outdoors. I set an early goal of, some of you might remember the Detroit News used to have a Sunday magazine called Michigan that was part of the Sunday paper package, and it was really fine. It had good stories in it, and I just said, I want to be in there. I want to bust in, and I did. And I had a cover story. It was one of my first published pieces, and that gave me a lot of courage and confidence. And then I said, okay, next I'll go. And Gail remembers this really vividly because I would say, okay, my goal is to be in Sports Afield, and then Audubon, and then Smithsonian. And I just set these goals, and then New York Times, and I just set these goals and I went after them. And after 5 years of carpentry and writing weekends, it was time to make the leap. So I've told this story so many times and Gail's heard it about the day that we made the decision. This was one of the big turning points in our lives, and we had one son and we had another on the way. And you were how 6 months pregnant, and our 7 months pregnant. And I had been a carpenter for 5 years, and our great friend Craig Date, who co-authored Canoeing Michigan Rivers, my first book, was staying with us. And we were sitting around the table, and I admitted that I was afraid that if I waited much longer, I would never be able to quit my job because we had a baby coming. And we had no money. And I mean, literally, we were living paycheck to paycheck. And I said, I don't know what to do. And Craig said, quit your carpentry job. And I said, oh, I can't do that. I mean, we need that paycheck. And, you know, and our boss, Paul Mowers, was training me. In 5 years, I'd worked my way up from a laborer to a crew chief. And he was counting on me to run this crew and do, you know, important work for this big project that he had just gotten a contract for. And I can't do that to Paul. And Craig said, he'll understand, he'll forgive you, just do it. I said, but we have no money. He said, all the more reason, do it. What do you have to lose? You know, and just he had an answer for everyone. I was throwing up all these roadblocks, and he was tearing them down. And I looked at Gail, and she goes, do it. And I did. The next day I went in, and poor Paul, you know, he had invested in me, really, as a way of looking at it. He had trained me to be a crew chief, and he spun on his heel and he walked away. He was mad at me, and I kind of expected it. I felt bad, but later he came up to me and he apologized. He said, that was wrong of me. I'm really, because he knew I wanted to be a writer, because I had written my first book while I was working for him. And he said, I know this is important to you. I want you to know I support you. And I appreciate that, Paul, thank you. And he goes, so how are you set for money? And I said, oh, we're good. And I think we had $60 in the bank, really. And he goes, no, really. And I said, well, you know, I'm going to figure it out, because I'm set up. And, you know, I had published some work, and I knew some magazines that wanted more, and I knew how much I could earn from them. And it wasn't enough, but it was a start. And he said, okay, here's what I'll do. I'll loan you $1,000 a month for 6 months. And in those days, this was the late 80s, we could live on $1,000 a month. And he said, at the end of 6 months, if you still want to keep going as a writer, great. Just pay me back whenever you can, interest-free. If you've changed your mind, your job is waiting for you. And then in that case, you can work off what you owe me, a little bit out of every paycheck. One of the most generous things anyone has ever done for me. So as it turned out, it took exactly 6 months for us to get cash flow coming in from writing, because it takes a while. You have to, when you're writing nonfiction, you contact a magazine or a newspaper with story ideas and propose it, and they have to have an editorial meeting and decide, is this the author we want for this kind of story? Is this story of interest to us? Is it worth it? And then they have to write up a contract, and it takes a while, and then you have to write it, and then you have to get paid for it. So 6 months is almost exactly what it took. At the end of that 6 months, we were making $1,000 a month. The next year, it doubled. The year after that, it doubled again, and we were able to pay Paul back. So what a great gift he gave us. And I'm about to dedicate a book to him in the next year or so. So that's what it was. It was, you know, I tell young writers that we took a blind leap, or we took a big leap, but it wasn't blind. We planned, we thought about it, and I had read every book in the library on how to be a writer, and I knew how the business worked. So I had a really good instinct for the business by then, and then I knew what I was capable of, and I knew what I was interested in. So I just started writing the things I was interested in. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's how it all came about. And one thing led to another, you know, that I did get into the New York Times, and that attracted the interest of agents and book publishers. And one thing, you know, leads to another, and good things start to happen. So.
talked about how the publishing world's changed.
Yeah.
And how you started your own press, and maybe that'll be, you could add for those who haven't heard it. But then what's connected with that was how you talked about how the rest of the world does not know about the Great Lakes. So my question is, what's connected with a regional press, whether it's, I'm going to say Wayne State, probably a large regional, versus smaller ones, maybe publications that you would see in gift shops, like a lighthouse or a historical center, more of small regional press. So my question is, what's the health or the background of regional presses, if that's the correct word?
Yeah, regional presses definitely.
Which really is maybe what yours is.
It is so far. And, well, the first book, Canoeing Michigan Rivers, was published with a regional press, a small press out of Davison, Michigan, called Freed Publications. That's no longer in business. The owner retired and sold all his stock to another regional press, Thunder Bay Press. They are really important for regional publications because the bigger publishers, first of all, aren't very interested in regional topics. Then there are some national publishers, like Country Sport Press is one that pops into mind, because they recognize that regional books sell really well in a small region. And, Canoeing Michigan Rivers, after 30 years, is still in print and is still selling briskly. I mean, we can count on, for many years, it paid our income tax every year, the royalties from that book. It was just a steady seller. But in the eyes of the big New York presses, a book that sells, at this point it's probably 60,000 copies that have sold in 30 years. So that's nothing to the New York press. But to a regional publisher, that's good. If they have 10 books that are doing that well, they can stay in business. So there's presses like Country Sport, which are in New England, said, well, why don't we publish regional books all over the country that tap into that possibility? And they've done some good books, but I don't think they do nearly as well as the independent regional publishers, because they are in touch with their readers. They know their readers really well, and probably even more importantly is they have good relationships with the booksellers. And every bookstore has a regional section, and it's one of the most popular sections in each bookstore. So regional publishers are very important to bookstores and to writers. And I always recommend it's a great place to start for a writer. If you have a topic that has a mostly regional interest, it's really a good place to go. Our press, I guess we aren't really even calling it a regional press because our first two titles are national books. But we will be doing some regional books as well. And these will be books that own, at least for now, for the foreseeable future, that artist Glenn Wolfe and I do together. And we're started with 2 reprints from our earlier books that are out of print that we got the rights back to. And we brought them out in new editions that we really like, the way we kind of wish they had always been done. And we're only selling them through independent bookstores. So that's the way our little twist on it is different. Yes?
I recently read an interview you did with Jim Harrison a few years ago in the Traverse City paper. What might you have learned from him as a writer?
Jim Harrison, does everyone know Jim Harrison's work? He's an interesting guy. He goes his own way. I think probably the biggest thing that I learned from him, and I learned it long before I met him, because I learned it from reading his books and sort of picking up on it, is that he does exactly what he wants to do as a writer. He doesn't play by anybody else's rules. He isn't trying to please the establishment. He isn't trying to please the critics. He's writing exactly what he wants to write, which strikes a chord with a lot of people, because he writes as a wild man. There are no rules holding him back. And I'm not that kind of a person to that degree anyway at all. I mean, he would show up at this event drunk. And he would do it, I think, just to say, I can do it. I can get away with it. And I started out by being too well behaved, and now I can't get out of that. I'm stuck with it. But what I learned from him was that there's freedom. It should be, and creativity of every sort should be about freedom. it should be about not worrying about what anybody says and not caring what the critics say, because the critics don't get it anyway. You just have to write what's in your heart, and he's got a big heart. There's a lot, people think of Jim Harrison as this gruff, one-eyed guy, and he talks just like this. All he says is cigarette, and that son of a bitch, and exactly. But he's got a huge heart, and he really cares deeply. His characters come alive so much because he loves them. He loves his characters, and especially, I think, well, his male and female, but he loves his women characters too. And a lot of feminists take exception with him because he's, in his books there's a lot of coupling going on, and it's often guys who are just getting their rocks off, right? But the women he loves the women in his books, and it's all about following his heart. So that's probably what I've learned most from him as a writer. I don't know him well enough personally to know. I wish that we had gotten to know him better when he lived in Michigan. We knew who each other. We said hi, and talked briefly a few times, but that was it. It was really fun, really interesting interviewing him.
There's some water there, I think.
Oh, thanks. It's some writers are a lot more invested in writer friends than I am, but it is important to me too. I have learned a lot from other writers, and the work is so solitary, you need a social life, and I have a lot more fun with non-writers because there's always problems, there's insecurities, there's jealousies and stuff like that, but it's really fun to have writer friends and to compare notes and to swap ideas and to give each other a hard time and stuff. And I have a group, there's 10 of us who've been camping and hunting together every year in the UP for 30 years. And we get together every year, and it's like no time has gone by, and we just have a blast and just, share ideas and stuff. So it's important. And, Harrison is very social in that way. He's got a huge network of writer friends, and I can see the value of that. What else is there to talk about?
I wondered if you felt that opportunities for writers have gone on into the internet, and that there are fewer newspapers, journalism schools have closed all over the country. Would you comment on that?
Did everyone hear it? Yeah, it's changed so much. When I was coming up, it was a real traditional model. What I did was setting goals in getting published in newspapers and magazines and reaching for a bigger audience all the time, and then getting an agent, and then getting a book publisher. I don't know what a young writer would do now. I know I've read enough to know there are a few strategies that have worked and a few that are a lot of people are trying. There are people who are just blogging and who have gotten book contracts, and some of them have been great and have led to really great books, and that's positive. But I don't know how you make a living as a writer anymore when you're starting out, because the online publications don't pay much, and the only ones that, my understanding of it at least, is that the ones that are paying often are using that model where you get paid more by how many likes you get, how many clicks you get, which is a really sure way of guaranteeing that they're going to be writing about the same old stuff. 10 ways to, do this or that, and it's not going to inspire new ideas and it's not about the writing. It's about the popular ideas. And I don't know. The the state of journalism is tough. There's a few things that are going on that I have some experience with that I think are encouraging. One, in the field that I've read so much about, water, there's an independent group called Circle of Blue, and they're headquartered in Traverse City. And what they are doing is they are funding themselves through grants from foundations and other sources, and donations. And they have a staff of journalists, and they are excellent journalists. There's some that were former New York Times journalists on staff, and they're spreading out over the world and reporting on water issues all through the world. And they're completely independent because of the way this model is working. And even though they have to scramble all the time to find grant funding, as long as they've been solvent, it's what, 6 years now, Gail? At least. At least. I think that, yeah. They are doing it, and they're getting attention. They're getting invited to some world summits on water and are being recognized as a real cutting edge model of what journalism could do. And I know there are others, and they do tend to be specialized. There's groups on social issues that are doing something similar, and that may be the wave of independent journalism for the future. The others are in trouble. Magazines, less and less. Harper's, which for many, many years has been a really strong organ of left-leaning journalism, is dwindling. That magazine's getting smaller and smaller, and that's the death now. You see that with a lot of them. The Atlantic seems to be doing pretty well. New Yorker, of course, is doing well, but they're doing less and less journalism, especially that long-form, really ambitious, investigative stuff, because they don't want to spend the money. Everything's so expensive to do. And so I don't know. When I meet young writers who want to make a living at it, I don't have a whole lot of advice for them. And I found myself, saying it's not a bad idea to have a day job and write part-time, even though that's not what I wanted to do. But I do have to add that the teaching that I do is I only teach usually most years just at the Bear River Conference that the University of Michigan puts on. And I've been doing that since 2000, 15 years. This is the 15th year. And I have 10 students, 10 workshop attendees a year, and I get to know them really well. And then out of those 140 students that I've worked with, there have only been a couple that I thought really should be working full-time at writing. The rest, I think most of us would do really well to write part-time as a vocation, but not a full-time one, because full-time writing is grueling and it takes a lot of determination. And for most writers, and it was the case for me for the first 10 years or so, you kind of end up having to be a pen for hire and write stuff that you aren't necessarily wanting to. I did a lot of work for an encyclopedia, for instance. I wrote a lot of encyclopedia entries. Yes?
I thought those e-books were getting popular, like on romance and all that. That was the way a lot of new writers were going.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, that's definitely true. That has been a boon for a lot of writers. But I sense that the gold rush might be over, because there's so many now that readers can't find them. It was word of mouth and marketing. The successful ones have really worked hard to market themselves. Romance, genre fiction, it's still, that's really the only place that really thrived. Science fiction, romance, crime, they definitely they were doing better than mainstream or literary fiction or nonfiction. But what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing from writers I've met who do that is, there's 10,000 new ebooks being self-published every month, and or probably even more than that now, maybe that many in a week. And how do readers find them? It gets really hard. So, do you have experience with that?
I just read about people who that's the route they go, like
Yeah.
romance, like the Harlequin romance, where it kind of teeters almost on the verge of X-rated, but that's basically, the route they take.
Yeah.
That's the little that I've read about it.
Oh, you haven't read any of them?
No.
No. I haven't either. My Aunt Alice, every time I publish a new book, I give her a copy, and when I see her next time, I say, "What do you think? What'd you think?" She goes, and she's serious. She isn't gooning me. She goes, "It was okay, but there wasn't enough sex in it." So finally, 50 Shades of Grey comes out, and she's a romance reader, and she reads romance novels like candy, And she goes, "Oh, here's a new romance series that I heard about. I'm going to read them all." She got them all, and she read them. Next time I saw her, she was like, she goes, I didn't know people did these things. It was a real eye-opener for her. So I'm working on a story called Story from My Aunt Alice Who Complains There Isn't Enough Sex in My Stories. And I'm giving it to her with both barrels. So, yeah, that's definitely worked. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey started as self-published ebooks. And, but to get attention, you have to be either really outrageous or you have to have some kind of really savvy marketing strategy. And more and more authors are hiring their own publicists these days. That's another thing that's changed since my career started. The publishers provided the publicist for most of the years that I've been writing, and they worked with the author to get word out about the book. And now even the big name authors are hiring their own publicists to do a better job because publishers keep trimming their budget. Now instead of one publicist per author, they have one publicist per 50 authors, So that's changed too.
How many books do you have in your library at home?
Of my personal ones?
Yes. No, I mean
of my personal
your
reading.
collection.
My reading. Well, first I should say I'm pretty selective about it. I don't keep books just to keep them. If I am pretty sure, or if I suspect that I'll want to return to a book and reread it, I'll keep it. If I don't think I'll return to it, I'll pass it on. But I probably have 1,000 in the house and 1,000 in my office, And I think that's pretty accurate because, the great essayist Montaigne, Michel de Montaigne, and he said that he moved to his tower that he wrote in a tower after he retired from public duty as a court lawyer or something of that sort. He moved to his tower, and he wrote in one of his essays that I sit here in my tower surrounded by my 1,000 books. And it had such a nice ring to it. One day I started counting in my office isn't a tower, but it's in the loft of a stone outbuilding on our property with a $1 million view of the bay that I keep blocked off because it's too distracting. And I started counting, just like I counted how many books in a foot of shelf, and then I measured how many feet of shelf. 1,000. Came out to 1,000, so I've got that in common with Montaigne.
There's a quote I've been trying to remember about somebody's unread books in their library, and it referred to it as potential. It's an old quote. Does that ring any bells?
No.
In other words, not a frustration about having unread books on your shelf, but it represents potential.
It does. I can understand that, and it's kind of fun to find one and say, "Oh yeah, I haven't read this yet," But I also have books I go back to and I've read many times, and certain authors especially, I just pick them up and I'm delighted. And the books that really had a powerful impact when I was young, some of them still do, and that's fun because it's different. Of course, as your life changes, you see it differently. So, reading's really important to me, and I urge young writers every time I get a chance to start. They say, "I want to be a writer." I say, "Are you a reader?" And I say, "Well, I don't want to pollute my style." And no, it doesn't work that way. You have to read it all. You have to read constantly, and then you will become a writer. But write too. Write every day and read every day. And I'm still in love with the books that really turned me on as a writer when I was young. And
What were
so well, the books that where I really became aware of what literature was, because to a certain level, as a young person, you don't recognize the difference between, pulp fiction and literature. And teachers would tell us, "You're talking, these are just old people who are dead. They aren't."
Walden is wasted on
Yeah, they aren't going to speak to me. But actually, Walden was one of the first that did, and I had a great teacher in 11th grade who was really patient and sly. And in my class, the class that we had with him, I was in it with like 6 of my buddies. And we took that class because we knew we could skate through it because he was a pushover, we heard. And so this is going to be an easy class, easy A, we don't have to work very hard. And we'd sit together and snort with laughter and be total jerks. And he never paid any attention to that. He'd never mentioned it at all. And then he would slip us books. And he would say, I know you guys aren't ready for this. And actually what it was that by the end of that school year, the 6 of us were probably the only people in our high school who were reading serious literature. And he just turned us on. He chose the right ones. He chose Catch-22, Joseph Heller. And of course, this was during the Vietnam era, and anti-war book. And wow, did that rattled us. It's so funny, first of all. You can't get through that book without spitting your breakfast cereal all over the table. It's so funny, but it's so heartbreaking and powerful at the same time. And then he just turned us on to book after book after book, authors that we would never have read on our own. And one of them was Walden. And it's intimidating, That's a lot of words for a young person to digest. But certain phrases were jumping out at us, and wow. So by the end of that year, I was a reader of serious books, and he just turned us on to the modernists, and Hemingway, of course, but we'd already read it. I already knew I liked Hemingway because of the outdoor angle, the fishing stuff. In high school, I would go to school in the mornings covered with fish slime. We'd go steelhead fishing before class, and I'd fished with salmon eggs for bait. And salmon eggs get on your fingers and they stay on, unless you wash, I guess. I just remember smelling I remember girls going like this because I smelled like fish every morning. And so Hemingway really spoke to me. But then, I had no patience for Faulkner until this guy taught us how to read it, He said, listen to the voice of this author, Don't worry about the words, just listen to the voice. And then I realized, there's a difference. Then I would go back to the stuff I had read before, and there was no voice. It was just the words on the page, no voice. And that was a big turning point for me.
Yeah, do you read John McPhee at all?
I'm a huge fan of John McPhee. Yeah, I've learned a lot from him as a writer.
He's still writing.
He is.
He's writing about writing.
Yeah, I know. I'm glad. I'm really glad. He's a brilliant. I don't hope everybody's familiar with his work. He until I read him, I didn't think it was possible to find geology interesting, and he wrote a trilogy of fat books about the geology of North America that is just fascinating. And he was a big inspiration for me as a nonfiction writer because I wanted to write about subjects that can be dry. Biology and limnology can be dry. And I studied him. I said, how does he make it so interesting? And it's because he turns it into a story, and he has characters. And his book on Alaska coming into the country is just a brilliant study. And the more you study that, the more you see his brilliance. The structure of it is so interesting, and it works in 3 sections and 3 different ways of looking at the world. And yeah, he's a brilliant writer. And has a long career. He started as a fiction writer, but he didn't. But he didn't publish as a fiction writer. But that's what he started writing. So some of that skill is evident in his books. E.B.
Favorite Michigan river to paddle?
Oh, well, the Boardman's my home river, and that's still my favorite. But I would have to say now, though, if the new rule is that I can only paddle one river again for the rest of my life, I would probably go to the UP and probably go to the Escanaba because it's long and there's a lot of variety, and there's a lot of state land and federal land, so you can camp anywhere you want. And I would guess that would probably be. I'd have to think about that though. Now I'm starting to think, the paint. And that paint's pretty great too. So. But I'm lucky that the Boardman is so close, and it's such a great river. And now it's one less dam to contend with. So we have 2 miles of new river, which is really interesting. We've been going out and watching it grow up around this river. It's this 2 miles that were under a pond are now free-flowing river for the first time in over 100 years. And it's fast, and it winds through this beautiful valley of course, it was pond, so it's low vegetation, but it's growing fast. Another 10 years, and there will be a forest there of young saplings, at least. And it's gravel and rock bottom. You're seeing rocks that haven't been exposed for 100 years, and it's pretty interesting and fun.
Did they do anything to
Yeah, well, they intended to. It washed out, the dam washed out while they were dismantling it, and it all went down in a surge and created a terrible mess and wiped out the trout population. And yeah, so there's a lot of bitterness about that, and that's very unfortunate because it was intended, the plan was right. Do it very slowly, bring that water down slowly, and just get rid of the silt the right way, carefully, and it ended up most of it just washed away. So Mike, if any of you know the poet Mike Delp, he lives on the Boardman, and Mike's famous gadfly in the Traverse City area, and he's on Facebook every day complaining about the state of the Boardman River, every day. And I love Mike, and he's one of my good friends.
He was a year ahead of me in high school.
Was he?
Yeah, I haven't seen him in years.
He hasn't changed.
Yeah.
He hasn't. He's a great guy.
Yeah.
And he's a good writer, really good writer. He's got the Mad Angler series of poems that I think is what he's going to be remembered for. So, and he's a mad angler. He's mad in both senses of the word, I think. Wow, we've covered some ground.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, any closing remarks on analog versus digital? You touched on it in a number of the questions, from creation and mentioning Facebook now.
Yeah.
I don't have a specific question in mind, but if you had any additional question, and not so much the business models of journalism and all that kind of stuff, but just any closing philosophical remarks about analog versus digital. We'll give you 2 hours for that.
Well, I don't think it has to be versus. And I personally, I am embracing it all. I'm curious. I'm interested. I think we're at a really amazing time in history, and there's a lot of good and a lot of bad. And I'm because I'm so enamored with books in all their forms, I'm interested in it all. And so, we talked about this at lunch with Karen, that we're doing limited edition letterpress projects that are being made with machines that haven't changed since, almost Gutenberg. I mean, at least since the 19th century. The newest machine in Deepwood Press's studio was made in 1940. And these machines are making books where the ink is being stamped into the page. You can feel that, and everything about it is analog and handmade, and hand-bound covers. I love that. But I'm also fascinated with the new technology, and I don't own an ebook reader, and I probably won't. I probably won't, unless somebody gives me one. But I'm interested in it, and I've recently allowed all my books to go into ebook versions, and because I feel like it'd be stupid not to. If people want that, it doesn't matter really how you read it, as long as you read it. And I'm interested in it all, and I use a state-of-the-art laptop computer, and I'm delighted to be able to send my books to my publisher electronically instead of having to go to the post office. I've embraced all of that, and not every writer has. Mike Delp sure hasn't, although he's on Facebook every day. So yeah, I just think it's an interesting time, and even Chad Pisotnik at Deepwood Press, using this old technology, he promotes himself online, and he's in touch with everybody by email. It's just the world we live in. So yeah, I actually have met a couple writers who quit. They've quit because they don't like the way the world is going, and it's biting off your nose to spite your face. Why? But I guess it's just whatever everybody wants. Did you have a question? Comment?
What were your marketing strategies at the beginning while you didn't have enough money? Your marketing strategies
Yes,
at the beginning?
Why
you didn't have enough money?
Why did I not have enough money?
Yes.
Well, because as a carpenter, I wasn't paid very well, and I was non-union and proud of it. We used to say, if the union guys say if the first drop of rain that hits you, that's God's fault. The second drop of rain that hits you, that's your fault. And we'd be out there working in the rain, and then we go, wait a minute. They're making twice as much money. So because we had little money, there's advantages to that because you get innovative and you learn, okay, what can I do to make a little bit extra? And what works instead of marketing, you can spend a lot of money in marketing and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Or you can be really selective about what you do and use your skills and your time wisely. And what I would do for marketing my books was go to bookstores and meet the owners and the managers and the booksellers and talk to them and go to libraries and talk to library patrons and meet people, talk to them about your books and build up slowly, grassroots way. And it worked. It's a very effective way to meet people, and face-to-face time. That's the best way to do it. We didn't have the money to take out ads in magazines or newspapers, but what we would do is I would say, approach a magazine and say, and a lot of this had to do with canoeing and kayaking because that was my first book, A Guide to Canoeing in Michigan. And I would go contact a magazine and say, would you be interested in swapping, if I swapped a story to you for some ad space? And I would take a story that maybe had been published somewhere else, and I would tell them that this would be a reprint. This story was published in such and such a magazine last year. You're a completely different magazine. You're in a different market. You're different readership. Would you be willing to swap use of this magazine or this article for a 4x4 ad for my book? And that ad then would have our home mailing address, and we would sell books directly that way. And that worked remarkably well in those days. And we were delighted. If we could make a few $100s here and there, you get that cash stream coming in. So it almost didn't matter that we didn't have much money. We just worked with what we had and built slowly. And I'm sure we could come up with a lot of other examples of things we did. Gail, do you add anything to that from those days?
No, I think you described it really well. You just work with what you have and you build up. That says it really perfectly.
Yeah.
How you did it, and it's always thinking ahead. And he mentioned earlier about the list where he, first it was write something for Traverse Magazine, and then it was write something for what would be your next?
Michigan Natural Resources. That was a great magazine. Yeah.
So he just target, and it didn't cost him anything, for marketing at that point. He just would very methodically do that. You don't have to have money to write. And
No.
one of our kids said, last month we were talking, and Jerry was saying, yeah, we put your kids to bed, and then I'd go to work. I just had a little place in a small house we lived in town. And Nick said, well, gosh, I didn't even think of that, Dad. You're a carpenter during the day. I didn't think about when you wrote, but now I know. It was when you put me to bed. You went to work on that. So it's just little increment by increment.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen all at once.
Right. I just thought of another thing that we used to do, because as a money saver, and this was for writing when it was just professional writing, just for being this was for being an all-purpose journalist kind of writer. I would get a magazine to send me someplace. And one that comes to mind is the Porcupine Mountains in the Upper Peninsula. And I got a magazine, I think it was a magazine called Adventure Sports Magazine. And I proposed to them that they send me up to the Porcupine Mountains to do a story about hiking the trails up there. And there's hundreds of miles of really gorgeous trails. And we negotiated. Another thing I would do is they'd say, we can give you $300 for that story. And I'd say, can you go to $350? And usually they could. They would almost always have a little extra. And they would pay my travel expenses. So I'd say, okay, I'm going to go up there. It's going to take me 3 days to hike these trails and write the story for you. and you're paying for the gas and for 3 nights camping, not necessarily a motel, but camping in the park. So I'll go up instead for 10 days, and I'll pay the extra fees out of my pocket, and I'll do more than just hike those trails. I'll also interview the retired couple that was the host of the campground, and write a story for a magazine like AARP, the Retired Persons Magazine, or something about them. And then I will go and I will fish one of the rivers and write an article about fishing in the Porcupine Mountains. And another one, I would talk to people about what it's like to be there in the winter, write a story about skiing in the park for a skiing magazine. And I remember that trip, that 10 days in Porcupine Mountains, that I published 12 different stories from that one trip. And it paid well that way. The 350 from the first magazine really wasn't enough, didn't make it worthwhile, but the others did. So I would utilize the time in lots of ways. It helps a lot to be young and energetic. It exhausts me to think of that now. Why would I want to do that? But I did that. And then I would take the stories that I liked out of a trip like that, I would then use in 2 or 3 years, I would send out another round to other non-competing magazines, say, would you be interested in a reprint, and get a little bit more coming in. So there was always extra money coming all the time. So.
And eventually they become an essay on one of your books.
And the best of them, yeah, those would be the ones I would collect later in books, like A Place in the Water, In the River Home, and From a Wooden Canoe. Those are the collections of my favorite, the better pieces, the stronger stories that came out of those things. Very often it would seem like every different story I did was sort of a first draft of something else that would come along later. And so nothing was wasted that way. So thank you for that question. That's a good one. And you've got me thinking, man, I've gotten really lazy. I don't do that stuff anymore. Well, oh, yes, Pat.
I had a question about some of your writing that I remember was really just set up as a series of sentences of contradiction. That Michigan has the best wild country and the best rusted industrial landscape, and Michigan this and Michigan that. And I can't remember. I thought it was in the Winter book, so I thought...
It's the prologue to that book, to The Windward Shore.
The Windward Shore.
Yeah, the prologue. It's and it was more about Michigan. It was about the Great Lakes region, the whole region.
It was about
What is special about this place, and what's heartbreaking about it, and then what's beautiful and what's ugly.
It really, was an AC/DC kind of alternating current.
Yeah,
Of,
which is true, isn't it true?
Yeah.
I think it's true of most places, but yeah. Oh, it's good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jerry produced a really nice video with that in the background that is currently on the library's website as well to help promote reading together. So even though it's from the Windward Shore,
Okay.
you could hear Jerry reading it, and it's really nice.
We really have a lovely library here. They have...
It's a lovely
I have to
library.
say, part of it for me
Oh, I
is
know.
some history there, but they have a great website. You no longer have to crawl through the stacks. You just kind of order up. What's new? What am I interested in reading? Bang, bang, put it on your hold list. They send you an email. We got it for you now. You come down. You can park in front of City Hall, run down the block, go get all your books, get them checked out by yourself, and run back before anybody knows that you're
That's great.
I don't, that's my patented retirement library trick. Modus operandi.
Well, I was impressed. I got a tour of it. Karen gave me a tour this morning, and I was impressed. It's a beautiful library. And
Good job.
I've never seen a public library with a law library before. That's amazing. It's great. I guess. I don't know anything about the law, and I hope I don't have to.
The county law library. So.
So.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Pleasure